Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Social Inclusion webinar series. This is the fifth of our webinars, and I have great pleasure in introducing a colleague, a co-author, and a professor of Georgetown University, Gillette Hall.
And a friend.
And a friend, exactly. So we already are having fun at this webinar, and I just wanted to introduce Gillette to you. She is an economist by training, but more than being an economist, she is somebody who has really advanced the evidence as far as Indigenous peoples are concerned. Her latest book with Harry Petrinos is an edited volume, and this is that edited volume. It's called Indigenous Peoples, Poverty and Development. This is the second of the volumes that she and Harry have done. The first one was on Latin America, and this one is more global. And hopefully there's going to be another one soon. So Gillette Hall is somebody who has really thought about evidence and data as far as Indigenous peoples are concerned. And this is something terribly important because too often issues of Indigenous peoples get relegated to an advocacy agenda, when in fact what we really need to do is to build more of the evidence. So great pleasure in introducing Gillette. I also wanted to introduce to you our sign language interpreter, Jeffrey Bowden, who will be doing simultaneous interpretation in ASL. Thank you very much, and it is over to you.
Thank you. It's truly a pleasure to be here this morning, back to my old haunts at the World Bank, back to being together with my friends and colleagues. If we could move to the next slide, that would be wonderful. And yes, if you could bring up all the points. Thank you. So this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm going to submit to you and hopefully show you evidence to convince you that Indigenous peoples around the world are overrepresented amongst the global poor, and that gap is for the most part not closing. I'll focus on talking a bit about what are some of where I see the key failures or reasons behind the failure to close this gap, and what are some of the opportunities, as well as talk about the policy and research agenda going forward. So I'd like to begin with a short story. I was at the doctor's office the other day. The doctor asked me a little bit about what I did, and I tried to explain, and then somehow the subject of this webinar came up, and she said, "Oh, what's it about?" And I said, "Indigenous peoples and poverty." And she paused and said, "Who goes to that?" So I see that we have 40 people here joining us today, but I tell that story because this tends to be viewed as a fringe issue, and my research indicates that in fact it is not, in my view at least, a fringe issue. And to support that, I've just put some motivating, let's call them stylized facts up here on this first slide. So Indigenous people, roughly speaking, make up about 5% of the global population, but 10% of the poor, so very overrepresented among the poor. In terms of numbers, you'll see there we estimate 250 to 350 million people worldwide fall into this category. That's more than the population of the United States, a little bit under the population of Western Europe. And we could be sure that should the issues that plague Indigenous peoples plagued the entire population of the United States or the entire population of Western Europe, we'd be hearing a lot more about it. So moving ahead, what we need to think about first is, what do we mean by this concept of Indigenous? Many people tend to think about it as this picture here shows. If you could go to and click one more time, please. So I think all of you would agree that the gentleman that we see here in this photograph could be categorized as Indigenous. You'll see by the text on the slide, this is the gentleman on the far left is actually a fairly famous Indigenous leader from Brazil. Moving forward, let's take another look. So these children you might not so easily consider Indigenous, but in fact they're members of India's scheduled tribe, have migrated to urban areas, but face serious issues of poverty, deprivation, and exclusion. Third example, would you consider this woman Indigenous? So she's a doctor from Australia, and if you see by the little description that came out in the newspaper about her, she likes to play netball, she's a volunteer firefighter, she eats mango ice cream, she likes to watch Grey's Anatomy. She's Indigenous. So one of the points made in setting out the framework for our most recent, the work in our book, there's this lovely quote here. In many cases, there's an odd calculus at work, whereby the less clothes you wear, or the more clothes you wear that are distinctly ethnic, the more we're happy to consider you to be Indigenous. Now, there are two interesting problems with this. One, it perpetuates a sort of Westernized fiction of what we believe Indigenous to be or not to be. But secondly, it brings us, I would submit to you, close to a dangerous tautology, where we'd say you have to be poor to be Indigenous, so therefore are all Indigenous people poor? Then my job is done, why write this book? On the other hand, if you move out of poverty, are you no longer Indigenous? Same issues there. And these types of traps we want to studiously avoid, because Indigenous identity is much more than the issues that have so far been put on the table. And it's very complicated. So first of all, the concept of being Indigenous is, one could say, clouded by these external labels and stereotypes of what it means or what it doesn't mean to be Indigenous. But secondly, it's very politically sensitive and can be contentious. This is especially the case in Africa, where the work on Indigenous peoples, in my view, is the most underdeveloped and poorly carried out, including my own. But for example, the Maasai tribe in Kenya make up at least 30% of the Kenyan population. They are considered Indigenous by the United Nations Permanent Forum. They consider themselves to be Indigenous, but the government refuses to recognize them as Indigenous peoples. Therefore, international institutions such as the World Bank have trouble recognizing them as Indigenous because this complicates or can jeopardize their relationship in working with that government. Thirdly, it's changeable according to these alternative definitions. Some people take it as far as saying the abrogation of international, or not international, but of sovereignty treaties can be part of the definition of Indigenous. But it's also fluid and changeable over time and space. Two interesting examples here. In Guatemala, before the peace accords, there were very low estimates of the Indigenous population that is self-declared in surveys. After the peace accords, the Indigenous population more than doubled. So obviously, during a time of conflict where your life might be in jeopardy, if you declare yourself to be an Indigenous person, you're not going to declare it. Once the peace accords come in, you are actually happy to embrace your Indigenous identity, or you feel safe embracing that identity. In Peru, where I've done a lot of work personally, if you go by self-identification, almost half of the population of Peru would fall into the category of Indigenous, or does fall into that category. However, if you go by mother tongue, it's about a quarter of the population. There are different terms used across regions. Indigenous is the term that is most commonly used in Latin America, but in parts of Asia, the terminology is quite different. Ethnic minority is used to denote what many people consider to be Indigenous, and in India, scheduled tribe. So, tough to pin down what is or is not Indigenous. So, with that backdrop going forward, how do we tackle this? First of all, we don't try to resolve any of these complicated debates. Secondly, following the UN and the World Bank, we avoid also putting forth our own rule of what we will consider Indigenous or not. We go ahead and recognize any peoples whom a government or any institution, including self-identified groups, describe as satisfying any definition of being Indigenous, but then to go ahead and do our empirical analysis, we are limited by countries that have representative survey data and a rough estimate of the size of the indigenous population. So basically, we try to go everywhere where there's a large indigenous population and where we have good data. The exception there, again, is Africa, because there are a lot of groups in Africa that many would recognize as indigenous, where there is data that we could use, but it is highly contentious. And so we steered clear of some of those. We use self-identification as a definition wherever possible. Now, what's interesting is, following that strategy, our results cover what we believe to be about 80% of the global indigenous population. So, and clearly, given my own focus or interest in development, we cover more of the indigenous population in the actual quote-unquote developing world. So let's go to some of the basic results. So first of all, where are indigenous peoples concentrated? So it might come as a surprise that of the total indigenous population, only about 8% reside in Latin America. A far greater proportion reside in China and South Asia. And if you add Southeast Asia to that, we are up to about over 70% of the indigenous population. So what's interesting here, and I fell into this trap as well, our first study being concentrated on Latin America tends to get a lot of the interest, a lot of the research, but most indigenous peoples are not located there. So where are the indigenous poor? The indigenous poor are actually distributed a little bit more evenly. If we go with this total of 10%, representing 10% of the world's poor, 40% of those are in South Asia, 20% each in Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia, and smaller in China. So if our interest is addressing poverty and indigenous peoples, we actually get a more equal spread across the regions, but a concentration in South Asia. So the first thing I can tell you is that we can confirm that indigenous peoples are indeed poorer, and that is everywhere that we looked. What I'm showing you here are only the countries that we added for the second book that takes the study global. We found the exact same results, however, in Latin America. In every single country where we look, indigenous are poorer. So if you look at this chart, just very quickly to lay it out for you, the poverty head count, or the percent of peoples that are poor, the dark blue bar represents indigenous in a given country, and the light blue bar is non-indigenous. So everywhere we find them to be poorer. But more of interest, and I think as motivation for our work as a development community, we find that with a few exceptions, over time, the poverty rate tends to fall more slowly for indigenous populations. This chart is a little bit murky, and I apologize for that, but just to make it, try to make it clear, across all the countries in the chart, and we take the data back as far as we can to find comparable data and show you the average annual percent change in the poverty rate, indigenous peoples versus non-indigenous, you'll see that the blue bar represents indigenous peoples and the pale green bar represents non-indigenous. So you will see that in most cases the blue bar is shorter than the pale green bar. You will also see that there's an interesting exception, which is China. We are only covering a short period of time there, however, but China, being the powerhouse in poverty reduction around the world, has also done a very good job at closing or beginning to close the indigenous poverty gap. So why? What's going on here? I am going to submit to you our focus today in this talk that there are two areas where I think we can look to start to understand and disentangle what underpins the indigenous poverty gap. Of course, there are many reasons. Many people will look at issues of land. We can circle back to that during the question period if you like. But early child development, I have come to believe, is one of the main reasons why we continue to see Indigenous peoples unable to emerge from the poverty trap in which they find themselves. Secondly, there is some interesting emerging evidence on the role that discrimination plays in holding people into chronic poverty, and Indigenous peoples are certainly, or the evidence is starting to show us that they are experiencing discrimination in various forms that is also a part, I believe, a significant part of the poverty trap. So first of all, why early child development? We are starting to get a large body of evidence, not necessarily particular to Indigenous peoples, but particular to children all over the world, that, I'm sorry, I thought there was a slide in there that obviously there isn't. What I was meaning to show you was some examples of the broad range of evidence showing that early child development is a key factor in determining whether any individual will move out of poverty. And again, I can circle back to that evidence if you like, but basically look to James Heckman if you're interested in finding more of this data. But for example, we know that low birth weight is linked to later low averages on test scores, that children with chronic health conditions have lower educational attainments, and in adulthood, lower wages and employment, and that health treatment effects soon after birth will raise school outcomes years later. Why I think this is important is that there is evidence, we have found evidence, that there is a wide Indigenous child development gap. It opens up very early. It can combine with other identities to compound the disadvantage of Indigenous peoples. Interestingly, it's not uniform, and this is the case for actually all of our evidence, even the poverty rates. When you start to break Indigenous peoples into subgroups, you'll see that some groups are actually doing far better than others. Oh, here's the slide I was talking about. So I believe this presentation will be posted after the, yes, it will be after the webinar. So if you want to go back to that evidence, there it is. But here's what I'd like you to focus on. In the limited time that we have, I wanted to show you just a smattering or an example of what we're finding in terms of the child development gap. So stunting rates all over the world, in every country we look, and these are just some examples, for children under age 5, and stunting is an indicator of serious chronic malnutrition, are very much higher for Indigenous children as opposed to the national average. Indigenous children are also at far greater risk of dying before they reach age 5. And again, here are just some examples from all over the world. I mentioned before this compounding. This is actually a slide that I'm borrowing from my dear friend Maitre. This is what in social exclusion parlance we call the double disadvantage. What this shows you is that being Indigenous or can entwine with other factors, such as, in this case, gender, to compound the degree of gap or disadvantage that an individual experiences. So what you see here is are the chances that are calculated of being able to complete secondary school, and this is in Bolivia. And if you take as a reference point on the left the Bolivian man, you'll see that with that as a reference point, if you are a Bolivian Spanish-speaking man, excuse me, if you are a Spanish-speaking woman, you have 5% chance less of completing secondary school. If you are a Quechua-speaking man, 14% lower chance. Quechua-speaking woman, 28% less. And I just love that graphic, Maitre, so thank you very much. Lovely illustration of the concept. Here is just some a graph showing that there are discrepancies across groups of Indigenous peoples. So again, we want to be careful not to, while it is very nice to group, to look, when we look globally, it's very effective to group everyone together and find evidence of these perturbing gaps. On the other hand, there are groups that do better and groups that do worse. So here we have across Latin America, the blue bar represents the average infant mortality rate for the non-indigenous population. And the bars going vertically tell you the infant mortality rate for the indigenous population. You see that some groups, if you look, say, to Chile, you'll see that the Mapuche are right at the national average. If you go to Paraguay, the discrepancies are really quite varied and interesting. You'll see that there's one group on the left which is close to the national average, but then there are rising other groups that experience tremendous child development gaps. So there is an agenda here to coming to understand also why certain groups can do better and certain groups are particularly disadvantaged. Turning to discrimination, here we have very, to my mind, compelling new and emerging evidence about what's going on. This is a perception-based calculation of discrimination. It's a new study done in Mexico, asking people what is their perception of their experience of discrimination. And so you'll see, I won't bore you by reading out every item here on this chart or slide, but you'll see that there are significant reports among indigenous peoples in Mexico of experiencing discrimination. This is, to my mind, one of the most compelling pieces of research that has come out in the past years. It's by Carla Hoff and her colleague, Carla Hoff being here at the World Bank. What she shows us, going to India, she does an interesting test in schools in India where she gives a basic logic test to boys. And the test is not affected by necessarily what you've learned in school. It's just a test of, in some ways, your innate ability. What she's showing us is that even that there is no such thing as innate ability, and that ability itself is influenced by circumstances. So what her research shows is that if you give the test to a group of boys and caste is not revealed, that's the two bars on the left, there is very little difference between the number of mazes that the boys can solve. However, when you conduct the test by revealing caste, and it's done by simply reading out a name, which in India is a signal for your caste, lower caste boys, sorry, I missed the key there, the lower caste boys perform much less well on the very same, call it, test. So here we have this emerging notion of peer effects. And if you come from a group that is stigmatized, or where messages are sent to you as a child, as a person, about your ability, and those messages are reinforced in school or in other areas of society, it will change your ability to perform or change your ability to respond to the opportunities that are being offered to you. And why I have this up today is because, to me, it tells me it is not enough to offer what we consider to be the typical child early development interventions, say getting children into school. Yes, we can get them into school, but what's happening in the school is equally important to determining how they are able to take advantage and learn in that context. And to make a final point, the beauty of Carla Hoff's work is that she mimics the way discrimination is carried out in school, wittingly or unwittingly, by teachers. All right, I saw that my dear friend Steve Radelet had signed up for this. I don't know if he's still here, but Steve, hats off to you for this lovely chart. What we see here is a calculation of how extreme poverty rates have been falling rather dramatically, or we should say steadily, since 1980 around the world. And what you see the blue line showing us is that we're approaching 10% extreme poverty rate around the world. My point to you today is that it does not appear to me to be random who remains in that 10%. That is, poverty is not randomly distributed across groups, population groups, and Indigenous peoples are a group because this gap, the evidence that I showed you earlier, because the gap is not closing, or poverty rates among Indigenous peoples are actually falling more slowly than for everybody else. We are not doing a very good job of making sure that everybody has an equal chance to move out of extreme poverty. Disproportionately and increasingly, I postulate that Indigenous and other excluded groups will remain among the extreme poor. So I visualize it as a sieve, and I visualize it as who's falling through that sieve out of poverty relatively easily, and who remains, and why do they remain. And to me, that is a key research agenda going forward. So my final points today are as follows. Indigenous peoples are often hidden in the averages that we look at when we do calculations about poverty and other main development indicators around the world. Shanta Devarajan, who reviewed our book a couple of years ago when it came out, said the following, Shanta Devarajan being the chief economist now here at the World Bank. He said it highlights that we have been off target in the MDGs, that these were the people whom the MDGs were precisely designed for, and that clearly governments have failed. It is the role of government, and should be the role of government, to help these people precisely to escape poverty. And we aren't doing as good a job as we might. And I would like to add that it's not just governments, but ourselves as development professionals and development institutions that sometimes allow these issues to be looked at as fringe issues. And in my view, they will become more and more central to the task of eliminating, or as we set this goal of reaching zero extreme poverty around the world, as I said in my previous slide, and you don't need to move back there, will more of the same work to move those who remain out of extreme poverty? I think is a critical question. So to address this problem, there are two key areas for work. As a global community, we've already revised the Millennium Development Goals. We now have the Sustainable Development Goals, and it does go some way towards encouraging us to go beyond the averages. So there has been some progress there. Secondly, I would like to highlight the fact that we do better evaluation now than we have ever done before. We do impact evaluation where we actually parse out the effect of our intervention and can eliminate any other causes for why we might be seeing the changes in the population affected by the intervention. But not enough do we go beyond those averages to understand how different populations are benefiting or not benefiting from that intervention. So my own work has particularly looked at conditional cash transfers, and there are some very interesting differences and discrepancies as to how conditional cash transfers are working or not working for the poorest of the poor, among whom Indigenous tend to reside. I think I will leave it at that. Thank you all very much for listening, and hopefully being a part of my passion for this issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jill. And so the chat pod has been extremely active. We will get at those, but I wonder, we actually have a set of questions that we want to pose to the audience. And Jill, I was wondering if you would read those questions out so that we can ask people to vote.
Looks like they're already voting too. We've got an active crowd out there. So the first question is, what do you think is the main factor that explains the Indigenous poverty gap? Read the second.
Yes, please. No, actually, just the options.
Oh, the options, yes. Insufficient access to investment in early child development. meaning insufficient access to or insufficient investment in early child development. Poor health, education in later years. And I don't know why discrimination is combined with that. That's a mistake, actually. So that's going to be confusing to answer. Insecure or lost land tenure rights, location and remoteness, or other. So it's going to be hard for us to talk about these results because of that confusion with discrimination being lumped in with poor health and education in later years.
Okay.
But we'll work with it.
The poll is now closed.
Okay.
And most people have said it's poor health and education in later years / discrimination that basically determines the poverty gap. About 31% say it's investment in early child development. And I have to say, Jill, to my surprise, only 17% think of land and forest rights and natural resources as being central to it. I would have thought that is at the core of Indigenous disadvantage.
Well, maybe I can take a moment here then, because there were some interesting questions.
And in fact, can we just go for a minute to John Cornwell's questions as well? Sure. And he makes a really important point where he says that there are systemic issues. So, talking about discrimination and other things is all very well, but there are systemic issues because of which Indigenous peoples remain disadvantaged. So I'm wondering if you would like to address some of those and lump those with a couple of other questions that came your way.
Sure. Just could you clarify? I haven't had you've been reading the questions. What does he mean by systemic?
There are systems of oppression at work against Indigenous peoples and other groups, and these are based on ideologies of superiority and inferiority, which are built over a long period of time. We need to deal with these systemic issues in order to progress. That's what he says.
Okay, so these are complicated issues, but in my mind, they are highly related to the issue of discrimination, because I think discrimination is the way that these ideologies are carried out or experienced. But I would like to turn to this. There was a question by Jason Payment that came in before the webinar. I had a chance to look at those questions. And it says, is geography a more determining factor than ethnicity in understanding poverty among Indigenous peoples? And that gets to the issue of land, etc. Right? So my remark is, very good question, and we all wonder this. But this assumes that most or all Indigenous are remote or rural. And actually, what I was attempting to put on the table with the first 3 photos I showed is that this is very much not the case, that there are many Indigenous peoples who are now living in urban areas. So while I want us to move a little bit away from the stereotypical understanding, yes, of course, for those Indigenous who continue to live a traditional lifestyle remotely, land becomes a key issue. And even in urban areas where land tenure is insecure, but that becomes the more run-of-the-mill urban land tenure insecurity issue.
Right, okay, fantastic. I think a thought that we should park is that yes, Indigenous peoples aren't always located in rural areas, but in many countries, especially where there are large proportions of them, they are disproportionately in rural areas, and that their ties to lands and forests are part of the systemic exclusion that they suffer because of non-recognition of those land rights.
And I think what I'll say there is that I have not seen yet that the issue of the major issues of land sovereignty and land security or historical land rights are very easy to resolve. So part of the reason why I go to early child development and maybe even discrimination as a policy area is that even Canada, which is in some ways one of the most call it advanced, politically correct, attempting to address these issues, it takes more than 15 years for when a Canadian Indigenous group brings a land rights issue to the Canadian government for it to even be looked at and addressed. It is very, so yes, it's important, but we have not yet seen a lot of, that it is very easy politically and pragmatically to address that issue. So I want to underscore it is critical, but we've been very slow to address it.
Thank you, Jill. Actually, I've hosted a couple of webinars, and this is by far the most active chat pod I've seen. So,
Yay!
I don't think you are going to be able to. I don't think you're going to be able to do justice to them, to all of the questions. And so there are two comments which say this is way too short a time. 1 hour is way too short a time to actually be addressing some of these. But there are questions that sort of seem to ask where things have worked. So Maria Beatriz Orlando, for instance, is asking us, A, do you think the SDGs provide a better framework? One. And two, what's the evidence on what has worked? She cites the Mexico example, which of course is there in your book as well, on the oportunidades. But would you like to talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I will keep my comments brief. On the SDGs, they're better, but I looked at them again carefully yesterday. The problem with the SDGs is we all want to lump more into it, and now I'm going to be guilty of that. Right? We criticize them, and I criticize them because they're now dispersed, murky. How are we going to track progress in all of these areas? On the other hand, I don't think it does a good enough job of reminding us that as we track national progress in key indicators, be they poverty, early child development, etc., we are not reminded enough to parse out and look at, but what's happening among key disadvantaged groups. So that's my comment there. Remind me the second one, sorry?
It was about what has worked in places
and
Mexico.
Yeah. Okay. China is a very interesting case to look at, and who would think, right, would you come up with the notion, if you wanted to learn about dealing with indigenous peoples' issues, would you look at China? It comes as a bit of a surprise, but the Chinese government has had a very deliberate policy over very many years of addressing this issue of geographic and spatial disadvantage. So they have made the most progress of any country in that regard, and that is why you see those ethnic minority poverty rates tumbling down. On the other hand, issues of exclusion and who remains in that sieve now persist in China as well, and there are groups doing better and worse. The Mexico case is very interesting. Oportunidades has been, by and large, successful at reaching indigenous peoples simply by targeting poverty. It is not an indigenous targeted program. The issues, however, are that it's not clear that indigenous peoples are going to be able to parlay the development advances they are getting in childhood into the labor market because of the issue of discrimination. It's also not clear that what's happening in the schools. To the India case, to Carla Hoff's excellent work, we don't know well enough what learning is actually happening in those schools and how indigenous children are benefiting or not.
Thanks, Jill. There were a couple of questions which I want to sort of pull together. One was, of course, one was also from John Cornwell. Now there's another one from Amjad Tas, really speaking to notions and definitions of indigeneity and what constitutes as being indigenous. I also just want to respond to a comment that John made about using pejorative terms like tribal. John, just wanted to let you know that I think Jill used that term in the context of India. It's not a pejorative, it is in the Indian Constitution. So it is a constitutionally recognized term, and indigenous people like to call themselves Adivasis, which is what we use as well. But the official term is tribals, and they accept that and embrace that term. So that's just as an aside.
Thank you.
But would you like to just talk about the notion of indigeneity and also Amjad says, please comment on notions and definitions of well-being and development.
If you don't mind, I'm going to go to that one first because I was hoping to get that question.
Fantastic. I'm sure you asked Amjad to put
no,
that
question in. I'm not that type of person. But if someone didn't bring it up, I was going to.
All right.
So listen, whenever we make this presentation, inevitably comes the question, why are you calling them poor, or why are you calling us poor? Indigenous peoples are rich in many ways, cultural and otherwise, in which they view us as being poor. So there is a a complex web of issues that come up when we try to define poverty. What Harry Petrinos and I have tried to do with this work is to precisely use a globally recognized, admittedly narrow definition of poverty, the world's standard, like it or not, for what we will consider to be poverty, that is national poverty lines or the internationally recognized $1.25, now $1.90 a day. Why? Because that is a basis for comparison. Otherwise, we don't know. If we say, oh, well, Indigenous people consider themselves to be rich spiritually, and we're going to apply some value to that, then I'm going to come and tell you, oh, even though they're materially poor, let's not consider them poor because they're rich, and we'll get criticized for that. So, admittedly, the methodology is weak in embracing broader concepts of well-being, but all we are trying to do is to confront governments and development institutions with raw, empirically solid, comparable data that says there is an absolute gap here and there is an absolute problem. And finally, what I would like to say is I have never had a conversation with an Indigenous person and have them tell me that they're happy to have their child die or they're happy to have their child not have enough food. So there is an argument for an abstract definition. Absolute definition.
There are a couple of questions that address or they ask about entrepreneurship and access to finance among Indigenous peoples. And have you given that some thought, and would you like to bring some evidence on that?
I do not have evidence on that, and that would be a very interesting item for the research agenda going forward. I think where the question is going is, are there discrepancies in Indigenous access to the many microfinance organizations or access to finance more broadly, and that's a very good question.
So there's also a question about matrilineal societies and whether Indigenous women that come from matrilineal societies have better outcomes.
I do not know, and that's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Excellent. So I think we have time for about 15 minutes more. And there's a lot, actually, there's some evidence that is emerging on looking at different ways of analyzing. I wanted you to speak to this issue of data and surveys. And the fact that even in this book that came out in 2012, we were using data from 2002 and 2005.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that and on analysis?
Yeah. So thank you for that question, Maitre. It builds nicely on the last point, which is as we track progress or change going forward, do we have the evidence that we need? By and large, most countries are getting very good at implementing household surveys. And it's the household survey that is the tool for measuring these types of changes and tracking progress. Not all countries do break out in their surveys the categories that would be highly relevant to look at. Mexico, until recently, didn't in its national household survey have a question on indigeneity. So there were many challenges, even in a country as relatively advanced statistically as Mexico. The main elephant in the room is Africa. There are many countries where, due to conflict or other reasons, the statistics are poor. Our book admittedly does a very poor job of addressing or measuring the issues in Africa, and to me, that's where the next frontier is in terms of data collection.
Fabulous. So there is a very interesting question on a very fractious topic, which is on education and language.
Oh.
And what's your view about indigenous indigenously oriented curricula and language?
Thank you. So there is good evidence to tell us that bilingual education is an advantage. The trick can be in implementing it. In Mexico, I believe there are over 60 indigenous languages spoken, and the government very well-meaningly implemented bilingual education, but often they were teachers who spoke one indigenous language to children who spoke another. So it can be difficult in countries where there isn't one dominant recognized indigenous language, or one or two. There was a second point there. Yes, I am not an education expert, but to my knowledge, what's tricky is we don't know exactly where the transition point is, where you move out. Do you do bilingual education all the way through college? Probably not. So, and it's obviously a key issue because it's an investment of resources that governments would have to undertake. And so knowing where to stop would be very important, and I'm not sure we know that. There is, if you don't mind, I'm gonna jump to the prior questions by participants because there's a related issue I was hoping to raise.
Yes.
So I got a question by Rasek Niembro. How to implement government interventions on indigenous communities without threatening their own culture. Bilingual education goes some way toward that, but obviously that's a very complicated issue. I wanted to tell a little story here. Years ago, when I worked here at the World Bank, we sent a anthropologist to the highlands of Peru to hold focus groups, discussions on whether indigenous parents were interested in having their children enrolled in bilingual education. And the write-up of the anthropologist said the conversation went flowingly and very well until they realized that I was talking about Spanish Quechua because what they wanted was Spanish English.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
Right, so we often come again with this Western
Preconceived ideas.
Right? And sometimes they're already leapfrogging ahead of us in terms of what they want. I don't have a good answer to that question. I simply wanted to mark that it is a very complicated question.
So there is a comment from Luis Felipe, who's our advisor on Indigenous Peoples, saying that we really need to focus the poverty discourse within the framework of the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that how do you bring a technical solution while keeping the rights perspective intact?
Are they really separate? Is it not a right to not be poor? Is it not a right to have your children live instead of die? To me, they're not separate, but I might not be understanding the question particularly well.
Okay, excellent. I think we have, how many more minutes, Reza? We have another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Would you like to address two of those questions?
I would. So.
And if you have time, there's also a question on tourism and the role of tourism. Yeah.
Okay. There was an interesting question here. Can you please, by Brian Thompson, could you please comment on the issues of indigenous populations within the United States? Well, interestingly, I've dabbled in this, and the same issues apply. I could show you photographs of the way indigenous peoples are living on reservations in the West, and you would be appalled. You wouldn't believe it was in the United States. On the other hand, there's a tribe, and the name is escaping the Seminole tribe, just bought Hard Rock Cafe. So there are groups that are emerging, that are finding their new place in the larger society, and there are groups that are devastatingly left behind.
I'm glad you said that because there were several comments on the United States, and it's a good way of bringing out a story of indigenous peoples coming together to actually assert their rights and their claims.
Yes, absolutely. The same issues apply worldwide. The only reason for the concentration of our work on the quote unquote developing world, and I say quote unquote again, so tying in with this issue, to me, we are all developing because the United States faces these very same issues of exclusion and discriminated groups as any other country. But being a development practitioner, having been raised in Latin America, I'm devoted right now to issues across the developing world.
Okay. All right. I think we are heading to the end of
Okay.
our webinar.
Okay.
I just wanted to inform the participants about two things. One, that in January we will have our next social inclusion webinar, which is going to be on sexual minorities. And that, so stand by, you will hear from us on when that webinar will be. I also wanted to say to you that our Latin American colleagues have done a seminal report on Indigenous peoples in Latin America. And that is likely to be launched sometime in January or February, and we will keep you informed about that as well. What we'll also do is, from the social inclusion team, we will send some resources out on the work that, on the more of the evidence on Indigenous peoples. So please stand by for all of that. And also, I would really urge everyone to please fill out the survey. Give us your feedback. Let us know what we can do more of, less of, better, etc. We would really appreciate that. This is work in progress on social inclusion, and this is hopefully going to be a vibrant group that will talk about other issues of social inclusion as well. So, Gillette would like to thank you very, very much for being here, and this is exciting stuff.
Thank you for inviting me. And I would be remiss to not recognize, his name came up, but my colleague, friend, partner in crime, Harry Petrinos. Without him, none of this would have happened. So.
And also would like to thank very much our sign language interpreter,
Absolutely.
Jeffrey. Thank you very much. This is an exhausting 1 hour. We can see that. Thank you for being there so that we can improve accessibility to people who were not able to access it without the sign language interpretation. All right. Thank you very much.
Have a wonderful
Bye-bye.
day, everyone.